Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand, and it's just me this week. The rest of the team are very busy putting together the final touches on reimagined buildings, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And I've got a special series of 5 short conversations that I had with various people, including Alex Slater, Delia Bellaby, Dr. Emina Petrovic, Lloyd Alter, and Nikki Kruger. They were all, well, 4 of those were speakers, and Nikki Kruger is the relatively new general manager of the Passive House Institute, New Zealand. And the other 4 were speakers at the conference in Wellington recently for Passive House Institute New Zealand. And it was great to be there in person. There were some interesting themes out of that conference, kind of relating to going beyond just operational efficiency and health and comfort, which often comes up as the sort of centre of Passive House conferences. There was a lot this time on upfront carbon, which is one of Lloyd Alter's favourite topics, but also just thinking about materials in general, where they come from, how much energy or carbon it takes to create those products, and the wider environmental impacts of those products. So I thought that was very interesting. There was a bit of a reality check, I guess, at the beginning, which was, I guess, a little bit alarming. Potential there to get a little bit, maybe not depressed, but raising the anxiety level a little bit around the urgency and the need to change direction, but also a hint of positivity in the fact that we have a lot of really great solutions, and we all in this community are a big part of the potential solution for decarbonising and doing things much, much better. Before we get into that, I got a few people to thank for everything we do at the Passive House Accelerator, starting with our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA. Thanks also to our founding sponsors, 475, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwall, and Zola Windows. And thanks also to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Icon, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050. All right, well, let's get into it. I introduce each speaker as we go. So let's start out with Alex Slater. Alex Slater enjoys doing interesting things with architecture and building science to help people get better outcomes for their home. He's pioneering consumer advice based on his skills with energy modelling. He's been a previous guest on the Passive House podcast and at Passive House conferences in Australia, so it was great to have him here in person for the PHINZ conference in Wellington. After the event, I asked him to give a summary of his presentation, which looked at the relationship between PHPP and the NatHERS energy standard.
The point I was trying to make, or I was making in the presentation, was in Australia we have a energy standard already, which is different from the Passive House standard in the way that it weights its energy loads, so heat loads, cool loads, and total loads. And it looks at saying what is an optimal building performance rather than what is an optimal electricity demand.
Yeah.
So it increases the allowance of heat loads, et cetera, for different climates if they're harsher.
Yeah.
And there's two schools of thought. There's schools of thought that that works, and there's a school of thought that it should just be the same for everyone, which is the school of thought passive house uses. So I guess the heat loads, cool loads, total loads is more in line with what compliance requirements are in New Zealand, in saying there are zones where walls have to be this, floors have to be this, roofs have to be this. And there's no indication of if that increases or decreases energy demand through those zones.
That came up in another conversation about the relevance of absolute targets versus relative targets. I can't remember. I think it came up a couple of times, but there was a commentary about that we should get away from reference building comparisons, and because doing 20% less of not very good isn't necessarily very helpful when we do have the tools and modelling now to say a kilowatt hour target, kilowatt hours per square metre or whatever the metric is. So that came out, I think, throughout the conference. I want to pick up on something you just said about the loads that you've got in Australia now that you can measure. So it's cooling load as well as heating load. And then a combined, and that's part of your national construction code, is that right?
Yeah, and so by having this thing called specification 44, it's a graph pretty much. So there's an equation for a graph which tells you what the upper limits of your heating, cooling, and total load should be. And I think it is a step forward if you have nothing.
Yeah.
But I also see a problem, and I agree with the idea that we should be saying, yeah, here's the threshold, here's the cap for everyone, no matter what your climate is, make it work to that because we can calculate it mathematically and work our energy down to a point and have a target. I get that. But once you have something that is already deemed to satisfy and calculates loads, you're pushing two different schools of thought. So in Australia, I'd say it's a little bit different where if we need to push something like 15 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, we'd be wanting to go to organisations like banks and other organisations that say, oh, yeah, we understand that it's going to cost us a lot less to service a loan for a home that is going to last longer and perform better and cost the user less.
Yeah.
So it's looking at where your market is rather than just coming up with something that needs to be in government because there's already something there. And I think that's the issue we face a lot here in Australia, passive house design.
There is in your, and I think that's one of the things that Australia is particularly leading on at the moment is that you do have both a NatHERS, so you've got an energy rating scheme, and many conversations about how good that is, but it is there. It means that there is a mandatory requirement for all buildings. And you have a requirement to consider cooling load. So both of those things I don't think you should take for granted in Australia because they're not commonplace. They're certainly not here in New Zealand, and there are other jurisdictions that don't have one or either of those. Something else you touched on was some of the calculations you've done around glazing, and can you talk about those spreadsheets that you've looked at and how you look at that in the context of optimization?
Yep. Yeah. So I've worked on a few projects, and I like to just see what the data does. And I think it's with the cooling load. I think that's actually really important, and I'm really grateful we have a cooling load calculation here in Australia, because when you look at windows, there's often a lot of marketing around, we need to connect the outside with the inside, and it's taken too literally.
Yeah.
It's taken too literally. It's saying we need to stand in our inside room and see the outside.
All
as
of it.
in full scale. But we
Yeah.
never do because, if you stand half a meter back from a window, you still see the floor, you still see the ceiling.
Yeah.
It's just a different angle. So we're just changing the aperture. So the calculations that I work with are what is the optimization of those windows to mean that we, in an airtight situation, of course, all buildings are becoming more and more airtight, we optimize for heating and cooling.
Yeah.
And so where's that balance? And on a particular house, I found it was around 18 or 19%. I've had and I usually get around that 18, 19% for a lot of homes. I've
That's
had
percentage of glazing.
but
Yeah.
sorry, I should clarify. 18 or 19% of glazing area to floor area
Right. So
is
that's
what I
not
found in a
proportion
single
of
home.
it's not proportion of glass to wall area. That's
No.
you're taking the percentage of the floor area.
In this case, it would be similar, actually. This
Yeah.
particular house had a similar wall area and floor area.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be similar. But because we have, look, and every project I model in the passive house planning package, I run against the Spec 44 because I've developed something that has them work concurrently. So I can see what the results are. And every time I do, I need to add shading and add ventilation as we would want to ventilate in Australia to meet the cooling load. And so I model the conditions. So thermal mass ventilation in passive house to understand how that affects the building to bring the cooling load to a place where it needs to be.
Right. Yeah. I am interested in that, increasing the awareness of the year-round performance windows. The fact that it's when you're looking at window specifications, you can't just look at one end of the spectrum of how do I maximize the heat, the sun coming in, because in some areas, in some locations, in some orientations, that might be the design criteria, the most important thing. But then there are other places where it might be more important to stop too much heat coming in summertime.
Yes.
And I think that's what you presented, is that there's no, it's not a case of maximizing or minimizing any one thing, but optimizing. And continually balancing those two things that are very site specific.
Yeah, and you can also have a bucket load of windows and make the performance really, really good. But that's such a waste of carbon in my mind.
Yeah. Which brings us on to kind of the big topic, I think, of certainly the first day of the conference. I took away that carbon was a big priority. What was sort of the summary or big outtakes for you for the overall conference?
Yeah, carbon seemed like a priority. And I think just being sensible about it. I mean, what Lloyd Alter spoke about is key. Like, it's just being sensible about it.
Yeah.
And living sufficiently, living humbly. We spoke about humility the other time that we touched base last time.
Yeah. People should go back and listen to that. Yeah.
And understanding what you need and what you want could be two different things.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the issue. And another thing I'd like to point out, though, is that every graph that we saw where carbon went crazy or carbon costs went crazy and carbon trajectories went crazy is around the time the internet started. So our behavior changed. That's what I've noticed. And there could be something in that. I'm not blaming anything or anyone. I'm just saying there's something around the time the internet started. Maybe we've changed the way we think about how we interact and how we buy online and how everything's instant and how we communicate instantly. And what's the cost of a server and what's the cost of the infrastructure to run that system?
And how easy it is to compare ourselves with 8 billion other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. And so we end up in this place where information is just so at our fingertips for a lot of good things.
Yeah.
But it means that a lot of the processes are misunderstood or not understood.
Yep.
Completely removed, so we don't understand where we get an apple from, or where we get, the latest T-shirt from the best band in the USA, or these behavioral things. And I think there's a lot of that with carbon. So if we say, look, what happens if we couldn't go anywhere than 50k out from where we live, that kind of thing. But I'm going a bit on a tangent here, but I think that was a good takeout, with having substantial resources but not using them excessively.
Delia Bellaby is a registered architect based in Southland. She's the chair of the Earth Building Association of New Zealand, or EBANZ, which is a network of architects, builders, engineers, academics, and people interested in earth and natural building techniques. This includes adobe, cob, rammed earth, pressed earth, and straw bale construction. A significant achievement that EBANZ accomplished fairly early on in their existence was the establishment of a New Zealand standard for materials and construction of earth buildings. I asked Delia to explain why this is such a significant achievement and what relevance it has to Passive House.
Well, it's a very significant achievement because it's about enabling people to use locally sourced materials and test them, and be able to legally use those to get building consents and produce buildings. So the first set of standards were established in the late 90s, in 1998, and there's 3 standards. One is based on engineering design, so it's support for engineers to be able to design structures using the materials. The other is for non-engineered design, so that's enabling architects or builders to be able to use the materials, and it sort of specifies the parameters of what's required to not have an engineer involved in the project. And then the third is about workmanship and materials, so that's all about the detailing. There's a risk matrix within that one, similar to the risk matrix in E2, which enables people to see, establish, weather patterns and where erosion may occur and what eave detailing and window detailing is needed because of that. So it's really the intent of it was to ensure that these materials could be used following a best practice, so that, to minimise building failures. So the standards have recently been updated. So we started updating those in 2020, and we're just about to get them cited. It's been a really difficult process to get the standards recited by MB, but once they're cited, it's going to make alternative solution acceptance irrelevant, really. You'll just have to demonstrate that you're meeting the standards, and then it can be seen as a method of compliance, a means of compliance. But it's been a long process in terms of procedure and convincing government of relevance. That's been a big hurdle for us.
Well, and also you're taking an inherently variable material and trying to, by definition, standardise its use, which is that's the big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a key component of the standards is about testing, and it's all about sort of low-key testing. So because the focus is very much on locally sourced materials to be used by, either owner builders or people wanting to source their own materials, we've got a lot of sort of erosion tests and, material strength tests and drying, shrinkage tests that people follow that are really quite simple, but they've got to follow and demonstrate that they're meeting those criteria. So what we want to do in the future is have more standardized, like each region has, quarries or contractors that are obtaining a lot of clay. For example, we've been doing quite a bit of work with Canterbury Clay Bricks, who are getting their own clays, and we want to actually do some lab testing of those materials. So we've got a central hub in each region that is actually, so that would then enable us to actually push the standards a little bit more. So you might be able to have less eaves or do bigger walls or, taller structures. So we're kind of cognizant of the fact that there's another step that's to follow.
Yeah. And what brought you to Passive House Conference?
Well, so I've always thought Passive House is an incredibly interesting concept. And when Jessica Ayers and Hiberna did the first straw bale Passive House, I was just so impressed with how sophisticated this really rudimentary seeming construction system can be in terms of, meeting a building standard, which is incredibly sophisticated and, and high tech, really. I've been really impressed with the developments that have even occurred within New Zealand in terms of how they've been refined with buildings that have happened since that time. And I've now, Lizzie, who works with me, she's a passive house designer, so sort of supported her to achieve that, and she's doing a passive house straw bale. I'm really excited about the potential of natural materials in high performance buildings. I think they've got a really good match.
This came through as a pretty strong theme about what we ended up calling upfront carbon, thanks to Lloyd. And also beyond that, even talking about the fact there's not just carbon, it's also thinking about biodiversity and some of those wider environmental issues, which is something that doesn't often get covered in Passive House. That was my sort of quick summary of day one. What were your takeaways from?
No, I totally agree. I think, and also the human aspects. Like I think, thinking about, to me, I think affordability and economy and resilience are really critical things. And I think natural materials have a real potential because they can build sort of we can use locally sourced materials to do bioregional kind of constructions or productions. And I think that we need to be focusing more on that, like occupant health, small scale, local, in conjunction with the high performance to get a really kind of more holistic kind of benefits socially and economically as well for people. And I think that's quite empowering for communities to feel like they've got building materials and good quality buildings being made in their region.
Is it using natural materials scalable when you compare that to the mass construction? You look at a typical suburb where there's either tilt slab concrete going on, or there's brick, and
I think it totally is. I mean, we actually had some discussions about this at the networking drinks on the Saturday, because straw definitely and hemp definitely, because that's already being wasted. That's material that's being burnt or disposed of now that we could be grabbing, and there's definitely enough of that material. The clay, each building, if you're using clay plasters, you might be talking 1.5 tons of clay. So it's really whether there's enough of that. But there is a lot of clay, and I guess it's making sure that it's done in a way that it's not extracting too much resource out of the ground, because I think that's a big issue with any material, with it concrete or anything that's using sands.
It is, but I mean, with clay, you're using most of what you extract. If you compare that to something like aluminium, I mean, the amount of ore that has to be dug out of the ground to make a piece of aluminium is massive.
Yeah, there was that great imagery, wasn't there, that Diana put up of that little concrete marble in that massive hole, And I think the thing is, because it is around the place, and it's not like, for example, I'm getting the clay for my project from a farm down the road, because I was talking to the farmer and he said, I'm just digging out my paddock to put in some soakage pits, and there's all this clay, and I was like, I'll have it, So,
right.
Often it's something that's kind of just sitting there quite close to the surface that, is being taken out anyway, so it's not such a large scale extractive thing. And that's why I think that focus on regions as well is really important, and really keeping it local. I think part of the reason that these materials haven't necessarily taken off as much is they're not easily commercialized, because, they're right there, so if you can kind of build an economy around them at a regional small scale, then there's economy to be made from it, and you can create demand that way too. But I'd be really, really keen to see how we might be able to do some of these research findings in terms of, hygroscopic performance and thermal performance, and actually really specifically look at that within the parameters of Passive House and PHPP, because I think it's quite interesting to see how that might help operational energy within Passive House itself. I think that could be an interesting research project.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because clay and potentially materials like straw do have some secret superpowers when it comes to absorbing and then desorbing, sort of regulating moisture, which is
so it's clay. Clay is really the key product in that performance, that moisture regulation. The clay, and
I think you showed some information about that, and also some of the surprising results, I think, around heat and fluctuations, or lack of heat fluctuations, when you have a clay element.
Yeah. So the research that Ling Tong and Canterbury University are doing into thermal mass was really interesting to see that the earthen materials were doing thermal mass kind of cooling and passive heating and cooling in quite a small temperature range, which was in that kind of 18 to 25 sort of temperature range, whereas concrete, for example, needs to get really cold in order to be able to absorb the heat, to be able to release the heat. So, obviously within a passive house, a concrete floor is potentially going to just be putting the heat out there slowly and overheating the building because it's doing it. And you also need a lot more airflow with concrete to get the cooling to work. We haven't really got research into how clay may help air quality. But that was one of the things that came out of listening to a couple of the other talks was, that key for reducing the air changes, but maintaining a healthy air quality. We know that it's good for moisture management, but it would be really interesting to see if it can actually assist with air quality, so preventing CO2 kind of in the interior space.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other sort of big takeaways in general from the conference?
I just think one of the things that I'm really interested in is generally how Passive House has really, the way they've influenced policy, and they've really demonstrated from the front by saying, this is what we do in order to create good buildings, and the diversity of projects that are out there now too. Like, I was blown away by the fact that there were swimming pools that are Passive House, having designed swimming pools and how complex that is, and I think that's amazing. So I really feel like having associations with you guys has got potential to really help us achieve some quite grand goals, because you guys have done a lot in a very short period of time, to really transform the building industry across the world. And I think that's amazing.
Following on the theme of healthy materials, I caught up with Dr. Emina Kristina Petrovic, Senior Lecturer in Sustainability in Design at Wellington School of Architecture. Emina's research focuses on the impacts of building materials on human health and indoor environments. I asked her about her thoughts on carbon being a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
My personal summary of the first day of the conference is that there was more than one of us that complemented each other in giving different facets of considerations that we need to take on board beyond just carbon and energy considerations, which possibly are the most progressed transition of all the transitions that we kind of need to go through. I used in my presentation the United Nations definitions that are talking about climate crisis. Then they're talking about indoor air pollution crisis and looking into biodiversity loss.
What do you say to people to not overwhelm them or not feel like it's just there's no point? Do you feel like there's a danger of having overwhelm?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. I do feel that there is a danger of people feeling overwhelmed. So, especially because I work with very young students in the first days of them physically being in our campus and not wanting to discourage action, but wanting to encourage and empower action. I have been for years trying to find different literature that can give us context for how to drive change, how to feel empowered, and all of that. So, the Sustainability Transition Framework, which I spoke about at the end of the presentation, is an outcome of me kind of starting to see patterns in literature of that nature. So I think it's really easy to be impatient, and it's really easy to be wanting things to be embedded in regulations and implemented fully. But it is very important to see progress and to see a whole lot of little intermediate steps that need to be made, and to feel satisfaction from the progress that we have done on a year-to-year basis, rather than looking too far ahead, because looking too far ahead can make us really disempowered, I think. But looking into what is needed now, what type of actions are needed now, and what type of progress we are making now. And I think that the Passive House conference this weekend was really brilliant on that level, showing some moments of real momentum being gained from all the effort that was happening in the area of Passive House over the past decades, but also showing where else we need more, action showing the scaling up and kind of like which groups start to play a role in scaling up interventions, which I think is really important because that is where that sort of understanding of importance of insulation and properly building buildings so that they can perform well thermally, whether that is using passive house principles or with full testing, as we have had kind of discussions about those two. But learning how to do that properly and having that disseminated, and then builders talking about the fact that now they know where the suppliers are, now they have a pattern of how they're building. So these are the success stories that we need right now.
You mentioned some of the toxicity materials, and one of the things that you spoke about, and I think some others picked up on as well, is about the amount of stuff that we're building and the amount of stuff that goes into our buildings. If we take walls as an example, that a wall used to be about 3, maybe 4 different materials. It was very, very simple. Over time, as we've added more insulation, then we've added weather tightness layer on the outside, we're adding air tightness, we're adding more utilities and services in the middle. There's a requirement there for it to be more complex because we're asking buildings to do more in terms of performance. How do we balance that need to manage heat loss, moisture control, ventilation, plus provide all the things that we expect a home to provide, while also not making them toxic and problematic at the end of life?
Excellent question. So some of it is the complexity, I think, might be more of an issue than necessarily the volume or the size, because if we go back in terms of history, heavy masonry buildings often had incredibly thick walls, especially at the bottom of the building. There might be even 0.5 meter thick walls. So in terms of material quantity, maybe we're not using more, but it is the processing, how highly processed some of those materials are. And many of the highly processed materials we proportionally still use relatively sparingly. Waterproofing membranes, for example, and those sort of materials, they're very thin. So per kilogram, they're not very significant contributor. I have real kind of concerns and questions about the insulation and the way insulation has made a whole lot of plastic often materials become quite common or very artificial composite materials become very common in the way we build buildings, because there we don't have all the science of how we can properly know that the product that we're putting in is really good. And even with natural products, there are often downsides. Like we can't say that we would like people to start growing significantly more sheep all around the world so we can have nice wall insulation, because we know that growing more sheep will be also detrimental for the planet. So there are some really kind of complex dynamics there, and I can't say that I have a good solution to offer.
As well as talking about the amount and type of stuff that goes into our new buildings, my conversation with Emina also covered what we do with the challenge of our existing buildings.
We need to think more about the existing buildings and how do we mobilize existing buildings, because replacing existing not very well performing buildings with a whole lot of high performing buildings would definitely create far too much consumption of material. But if we are very wise in the way we act with the existing built environment and to find a sweet spot of improving them the right level for the energy improvements that they offer, and that sweet spot seems to be very hard to identify. That would be a fantastic way of leveraging an awful lot of power in transformation. And in New Zealand, in Wellington, where I live, we're talking about some 300 buildings that need earthquake strengthening or to be taken down fairly urgently. And what do we do with those is a really good kind of example of mobilizing some latent potential to improve the quality of built environment without needing to put the full new set of materials into them.
I think there's this emerging industry of really good life cycle analysis and helping people optimize both the upfront, not just carbon, but all the other materials and the long-term benefits of any particular project.
Yep, and talking about that, last year I have had a student that looked into a conventional house and what is the sweet spot for retrofitting, and unfortunately, I can't see that we have come up with a particular one solution out of it, but there was the range became mapped up. And currently I have a student that is looking into two-story concrete mid-20th century structure that doesn't have any historical significance, and examining, what is the sweet spot for intervention in a structure like that, where you can actually go really high, you can go, you can totally change the identity of the building, you can retain it. There's a lot of kind of potential. And again, we're trying to map up the range and figure out what would be a good recommendation from it. And some of these early projects, because they're in a way developing their own methodology, can't necessarily also fully have the answer. Often these sort of studies would take 3 or 4 students, one after the other, to have a go at it before it starts to sort of congregate in a particular area of a solution. And then we can start talking about, it seems to be somewhere in that space, and then it can be tested a lot further, because it does take quite a bit of thinking through and collating the right information before we can have a good answer. Yeah.
What are you positive about?
I'm really positive about the fact how many, I think, everyday people would want to do better. And I genuinely believe that most of the people in the world right now are ready to make a change. The problem that we have is that we don't have very clear recommendations of what change should be made and how. And there is a lot of kind of complexity in coming up with a default answer. But I think that we have general consensus and readiness for really quick transformation. And what then happens is that a whole lot of people start to innovate in parallel. And in that parallel innovation, things are going to start accelerating. You would know the stories how the World War I and II accelerated a lot of technological development that transformed modernism in the second half of the 20th century. I think we are going to go through a period like that, where a whole lot of airplanes were invented, molded plywood got scaled up in a way it was never done before. Particle board was invented. All of those were invented during those war efforts, and we're taking them for granted. So I think we're going through a phase of a whole lot of inventions coming through. And in 10, 15 years, the world will look unrecognizable, because a whole lot of us will do our own little nibbles at the solution. And that keeps kind of building this momentum and amazing energy.
Lloyd Alter was the international keynote speaker at the Wellington conference, having travelled here all the way from his home in Toronto, arriving in Auckland and then taking a train journey down to Wellington. I asked him how the conference stacked up against others that he's attended around the world and what some of his highlights were.
The only other conferences I've really been to were the Passive House International ones. I've been in Vienna, I've been in Munich, and then I was in Innsbruck. And I've always expected Passive House conferences to be kind of academic and formal.
Yep.
And what I really liked about this was that it was relaxed and friendly, and so many of the presentations were really accessible. I'm not a PHPP person and expert in all of this stuff. And I just got to see a lot of nice work and a lot of really, I thought the discussion this afternoon about communication, since basically you and I both spend our time on communication about Passive House, I thought it was wonderful that they spent so much time talking to their members about the problems and the issues of communication.
Yeah.
And that some of the work that they were doing on communications was terrific.
Yeah. What do you take away from that as being the biggest challenge about communicating Passive House?
the biggest challenge I've always thought was starting with the stupid name.
Yeah.
And once you got past that, just that people think, it's a niche product for expensive houses.
Yeah.
When it doesn't have to be. It can be for everyone and should be for everyone.
Yeah. A lot of your focus was on carbon. And in fact, a lot of yesterday in the day one was centered around carbon and climate change. I don't think I've had that experience as much in a Passive House conference. I mean, certainly it's been mentioned, but there seems like a really big focus. Tell us a bit about your summary of upfront versus embodied carbon.
Well, I've always thought it was very important. Again, upfront carbon is, again, a communication issue. It used to be called embodied carbon, which made no sense and nobody understood. And now, at least here and in Europe, the term upfront carbon is becoming much more acceptable and used, which is important because it is upfront. It's not embodied. The carbon's in the air. Right. So we have to get that message across and how important it is. It's maybe because I have such a short attention span, but I really believe we have to worry about the now carbon rather than the later carbon. And we have to be very careful also that there's now people attacking Passive House with its layers of more insulation and triple glazed window as having more upfront carbon than a building built to code. And they're saying maybe we don't have to go that far. And they're wrong, because Passive House delivers so many other things. It delivers comfort. Yeah. And it deals with peaks. Everybody forgets the problem isn't the base load with electricity. If we electrify everything, it's the peaks. And we have to shave those peaks. Yeah. And Passive House is key to that. So we have to keep our eyes on the ball on upfront carbon, absolutely, and design our buildings to have as little of it as possible. But we can't lose sight of the ball of the operating savings that come from Passive House.
Yeah. You have some really nice graphs that show what the relationship between upfront carbon and operational carbon over the life of a building. So without trying to attempt to describe those verbally, how do you summarize that if you're talking to someone about how those relate to each other, and at what point, particularly with Passive House, does more emphasis need to come on upfront versus operational?
Well, 30 years ago, if you looked at, I showed a graph from 30 years ago that showed that operating carbon swamped upfront carbon in months. And then because
of the inefficiency
of buildings and the fact that we were doing all our heating with fossil fuels.
Right. Yeah.
And as our energy supply decarbonizes and we now have the magical power of heat pumps, you get people saying, well, if you've got heat pumps and you've got clean electricity, then insulation's irrelevant. But again, it's not. And what does happen in that, I have what I've called the ironclad rule of carbon, that as the electricity supply decarbonizes and if we electrify everything, then upfront carbon emissions are going to rapidly approach 100% of emissions. Yeah. So we have to think in every case what materials we choose to build our buildings to minimize those upfront carbon. But everybody says, oh, you can't. This is where also I get into my whole big thing about sufficiency, about how much do we need.
Yes.
I mean, if you have triple glazed windows that have higher upfront carbon than double glazed, the answer isn't to go to double glazed window, it's to right size your windows.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not give up comfort, not give up the mean radiant temperature that you get from a triple glazed window.
Yeah.
Just size them properly.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that idea about, and that came up in another discussion about stuff and just more and more stuff and bigger buildings. I think you had some graphs about where New Zealand sits and right up there with Australia and the US about the biggest houses.
Yeah, New Zealand on one table comes up in second place after Australia, and then another in third, and then the States, and then Canada.
Yeah.
And when you compare how our grandparents and even our parents lived in the size of houses that they have. It's ridiculous. We've gotten all this sort of house bloat and car bloat and everything bloat.
Yeah.
And we have to realize that, you can't just have efficiency and you can't just have renewables, but you also have to have what they call sufficiency.
Yeah. Yeah.
How much do you really need?
Yeah. As we get more electrified, and you mentioned heat pumps, New Zealand actually already has quite a high penetration of heat pumps. We've also got hydroelectricity.
Yes.
So we kind of rest on maybe a false sense of security with both of those factors. Is there a danger that we get lazy with design as we electrify?
Absolutely. If everybody just focuses on carbon instead of, as we used to focus on, sort of energy, and gets lazy because they say we're not putting out carbon, you're going to have those times of peak load where your electrical system's not delivering enough. You're going to have continuing storms and you're going to have continuing bad weather where you need the resilience that you get from the passive house, where the house itself, everybody's talking batteries now, but the passive house is a thermal and a resilience battery. It protects you in these circumstances. And we can't forget that.
Yeah, there was a great presentation today that talked about those peaks. I think it might have been Sarah Lewis.
Yes.
First thing this morning, that showed that graph of the time of having to put in energy and when it's cold. But with the passive house, of course, you can sort of trickle that energy in over a period of time.
Yeah, as we electrify, they're talking about billions and billions of new infrastructure. They're talking about putting hydrogen in caverns for the middle of winter and doing all of these ridiculous things to meet the peak demand instead of talking about just shaving the damn peak with more efficient buildings.
I guess one of the societal problems of that is that it is a societal problem, and it's an externality to an individual builder, because it's something that's a utility problem, or it's a national infrastructure problem. So who solves that? Because that's not going to come out in the costings when you're getting a QS to look at your design of your building.
Well, who solves it is what they're doing in Scotland, which is making them the law and making passive house essentially legislating it. They're deciding where do we want to put our money, in building hydrogen storage caverns or in making everybody build passive house. And if everybody has to build passive house, then suddenly the cost premium really disappears, because all the window manufacturers are into it and all the insulation manufacturers are into it.
Yeah.
So, then it becomes much easier when it's the law.
So we need to keep pushing on that policy side, because the savings are potentially significant for infrastructure.
Yes. The infrastructure savings, the rescue and help my grandmother's trapped in a freezing house infrastructure costs, all of these societal costs that come from living in crappy buildings are going to be very, very big. And I have a phrase that I was looking at, that our buildings have to be like lifeboats because leaks can be fatal. And passive houses are those lifeboats.
Yeah, yeah. You enjoyed some New Zealand houses while you've been here?
I'm going to be in the next week, going all over the South Island, seeing a lot of passive houses.
Well, they'll be the good ones. I hope you get to kind of experience some non-passive houses in New Zealand, because we've got some shockers.
I'm sure, yes.
I think one of the challenges with New Zealand is that we have a temperate climate, is the way it's often described. So we almost get away with it. Whereas, like, if you put a typical New Zealand house in the middle of Toronto or northern Europe, you'd notice pretty quickly, because it would be catastrophic.
Yes,
fairly quickly. But I think because our houses just make people sick, it's more of a chronic issue over a long period of time. And it's no less of an issue,
right,
but it's not quite as obvious. And I think that's part of our communication issue, is how do we say that message with enough urgency to get people to change?
Well, it's always been a problem with passive houses that everybody's just thought, oh, they need that in Germany and they need that. They thought it was a cold climate solution, whereas there's been so much energy recently. I mean, work by passive house people to convince, no, you need this in hot climates too.
Yeah.
It works both ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here we're in a changing climate. You need a building that can adapt to all of these different conditions.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and I was pleased to hear some discussion about overheating because that's definitely becoming an issue. I know it's an issue for Passive House, particularly PHI, with a 10% allowance. And I know a lot of New Zealand designers here won't accept 10%. They're well aiming for much less than that because that is going to become a problem.
Right.
So where to from here for you? You're off to have a look around New Zealand, off to Melbourne.
Yeah, and then I'm off to Melbourne. I had to cancel Sydney from my schedule because I couldn't change my flights, and they made New Zealand look so attractive that I'm staying here a few extra days and cutting it off on the other end.
Any thoughts on, in general, about or advice for this community here for how we go with Passive House? How do we grow? What do you suggest we do?
Well, I, again, was impressed that there was so much effort and energy being put into communication so that we can explain to people why it's actually important. We have to really, really get our ducks in a row and have proper answers to all of those people who are now saying, oh, we have clean electricity and heat pumps, so we don't need to worry about this anymore, because we know they're wrong.
Yeah.
But we have to really get together on explaining why they're wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be one of the biggest problems facing Passive House in the next couple of years. There's one American author who wrote an article titled "Code Minimum is the New Green," because he was saying we don't need to worry about those things anymore. And we absolutely do.
And finally, for this episode, I'd like to introduce Nikki Kruger, who's the General Manager of Passive House Institute New Zealand. Nikki is relatively new to the role and also relatively new to the building industry, but she does have a wealth of experience in other governance roles. So it's very exciting to have her on board. This was a bit of a deep dive for her, having jumped in relatively late in the piece of the organisation. So she was very busy and did a fantastic job getting her head around our sector and our industry. So I asked her about that, her initial impressions of Passive House and the role that she's found herself in.
The people here just give such a damn, and it's so fantastic. There's such a variety of different levels, but everybody's intention is so amazing. Everybody wants to do better and wants to improve. And, even though they're all coming from different spheres and meeting at different levels, there's such a strong connection. And I found that to be really obvious and really meaningful that I noticed.
Yeah. Did you get to see many of the presentations? I know that you were running around in the background a lot. Did you actually get to see any of the content?
No, I tried to. I was watching them from outside the theatre, the lecture room, just to monitor the sound quality.
Right.
But there were so many distractions. There was, so, as you say, so much running around that I didn't. But most of them have been recorded. One or two slight hiccups, but most were recorded. And I'm going to be taking some downtime and watching those because I think there's a lot of value in a lot of what was said. And the feedback that I got from the people in the room was that they were really phenomenal. So I'm keen to sit down and just.
Yeah, were there any common themes that you took out of that, or comments that you picked up on?
I think there were some comments in terms of, well, sometimes it could seem a bit depressing. So some of the people came out, particularly in the first day when you are talking about climate change and the impact and on the country and the world itself. That the initial feeling was, wow, there's a long way to go.
Yep.
There's a lot to do. But by the second day, people were then saying the thing was, it all just takes one step. We all just need to do one thing and continue to build on those one things. Yeah. And so I think the first day might have been a bit of a shock mentally to everyone with those statistics and, the sea levels rising and all of that visual impact, because there were a lot of graphs that showed that. And I think that visual impact would have hit some people quite hard. But at the end of it, there were a lot of conversations about how to get ahead of that, and everybody makes a difference. It's not insurmountable.
Yeah.
You just have to act now. You just have to start and act now.
Yeah. And of course, we had some good presentations on that second day, particularly Sarah Lewis from Passive House Trust and the work going on in Scotland, which is potentially a game changer. And also your counterpart in Australia, Alexia, pretty phenomenal. I know that you've had a bit of contact with her in your short tenure so far. How you're feeling just from that experience? What are your thoughts about Passive House in this part of the world from what you've learned since coming on board?
I think we have so much to do, but having said that, we are doing so much. We are leaps ahead of other countries in terms of what they're doing. Our awareness of that. I mean, there are places in the world that don't have this platform at all. In terms of Australia, Alexia has been an amazing support. Her and her team. They've reached out. They've offered all of their resources to New Zealand. So a lot of what they're doing, we're taking on board. We're having those discussions, and we're seeing how we can work together, because it's silly to reinvent the wheel. If they're making a success, and they are, of so many things, and particularly their education and their social media and how they're marketing that, we've got a lot of resources that we can tap into, and they've made it all very, very available. So my take is that everybody wants to be part of it. Everybody wants to lift everyone else up, which is amazing. So from a New Zealand perspective, Scotland, Australia, Alexia in particular, brings so much to what I'm going to be able to do going forward for our members and our community, which I'm going to utilise every opportunity.
Well, that wraps up my conversation with 4 of the speakers who were at the Passive House Institute conference in Wellington this year. And also we heard at the end there from Nikki Kruger, who's the general manager of PHINZ. Really interesting perspectives on that conference. Gives you a little bit of a taste of what was discussed there, and also what's going on in this part of the world. I've actually got a follow-up interview, more in-depth interview with Lloyd Alter coming up in the next couple of weeks, because after Wellington he travelled down to Christchurch and then Dunedin and Queenstown, then on to Melbourne. And so I was really interested in getting his perspective of what he saw in buildings in general, but also the state of Passive House in the Southern Hemisphere, or at least the little bit of it that he saw on his trip down to this part of the world. So that's coming up, an extended interview with Lloyd Alter in the next couple of months. Other things coming up in the next little while. This Friday, over on the Accelerator, we have Reimagine Buildings, where 17 speakers will show you how to decarbonise buildings. Topics will include how to reduce upfront and ongoing emissions, how to build resilient, healthy havens, how to tap clean energy, and how to make these buildings affordable, and much, much more. So check that out. All the details are over at the Passive House Accelerator website. Next week is also the Fierce Pro Forum, which is looking like a really fantastic event. This is October 21 to 23 in Providence, Rhode Island, tailored to meet the unique needs of fierce professionals, specifically those in areas with progressive energy policies, which I'm very encouraged that there's more and more of that happening. Really keen to, I won't be there unfortunately myself, but I'm really keen to hear what the outcome of that is and some of the conversations that sparks. And then the big one, we have the imminent launch of Reimagine Buildings Collective. This will be an online membership community where we bring together building professionals who want to step up and tackle climate change so that we can, 1, create the healthiest buildings with the smallest carbon footprint. 2, deliver the cost-effective and headache-free buildings that people want and that we need. And 3, sell their benefits so that people can actually get buildings built. And then finally, make a good living while we're doing all of that. Check it all out at reimaginebuildings.com. It's going to be really great community, and I hope to see lots of you in there now and ongoing. All right, that's it for us for this week, and we'll be back with another episode of the Passive House podcast again next week.